In this video, you're going to learn the 5 steps that you need to take to teach your worship team stage presence. Teach them how to model worship when they are on stage. Coming up. Hey, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. If you want to find those tips, head over to Instagram or Facebook at Leading Worship Well, where I'm posting new worship leading tips every single day. But you're here on YouTube, so go ahead, hit the subscribe button down below, and let's get into it, because today we're talking about stage presence. And some people like that term. A lot of people hate that term because we aren't on stage to put on a show, right? But really what stage presence is modeling what worship looks like for your church. So if you'd prefer to think about it that way, then you can do that. I just used the term stage presence because that's what a lot of people refer it to whenever they're searching for it on YouTube. So that might be what brought you to this video today. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about how you can teach your team to have stage presence, to model worship whenever they're on stage leading in front of people. I think that's an important skill for worship teams to have. Before we get there, I want you to pause this video real quick and answer this question. Simple question on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being your worship team just stands there and stares at the floor, 10 being like they're going like all out, they're running around like King David, like naked on stage. Maybe not that far, but on a scale from 1 to 10, how expressive is your worship team? How expressive is your worship team? Pause the video real quick, scroll down to the comment section, hit the like button while you're headed down there, and let me know in the comments below. I'll talk to you in a second. All right, it'll be interesting to see what the baseline is for worship teams. I suspect it's somewhere around a 5 or a 6, but that's just my guess. So we'll see. Today, though, I want to show you how you can help your team grow in their expressiveness or their stage presence or whatever you want to call it. So let's get into the 5 steps that you need to take to lead them in that. The first step to teach your worship team stage presence is it's got to start with an evaluation. You've got to evaluate where your team is currently at. And, your team probably has no idea what they look like on stage. They might think about it on the personal level of like, am I being awkward up here? But I doubt that they've seen themselves leading. I mean, maybe if you have a live stream, they've looked at it before. But like, evaluation is you sitting down and you've recorded video of your team. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Just set up your phone in the back of the room during a Sunday service or have somebody else record them just for the sake of them seeing what they look like, and then evaluate it. And not like you evaluating it by yourself and then telling them everything they've done wrong. Actually sit down with your team and watch the footage back and say, okay, what do we see? And people will be critical of themselves and be like, man, I just stared at the floor the whole time. And so you want to ask them this question. I think this question sets up the conversation well. It's, if someone has never worshiped before and they came into our church and saw our team up on stage, what would they learn from how we model worship? What would they think worship is? And then you can have an honest conversation around that question with your team. And maybe there's like a lot of good answers in there, or maybe you get some things that that your team needs to work on. Like, man, they'd probably think worship is boring because I'm just standing here staring at my instrument the whole time and I never smile, right? So watch through this footage with your team and evaluate where you're at, and you have the opportunity to speak truth into people during that time, but also your worship team is going to recognize for themselves some things that they could probably improve upon. So start with evaluation. The second thing that you can do to teach your worship team stage presence after you've gone through this evaluation phase is to watch other people lead worship. If your team is not used to modeling worship on stage, they might evaluate things and see like, okay, this is what I did and I need to improve it, but they don't have an idea of how to model worship or to improve upon what they're doing. So one of the ways you can do that is to just watch other people lead, like pull up a live version of some popular worship song and have your worship team watch that live version of the song and see what the people look like on stage. And we aren't doing this to copy those people. Like, it's not imitation. That's not what we're going for. We just want to have some ideas of what we can do as a worship team to improve how we model worship. And the key point in this whole conversation is you've got to do what's authentic to your worship team. Like, not everybody is hand raisers and running around and screaming. I'm not that way, so my modeling of worship would probably look different than somebody who does that. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. We just want to model worship for what's appropriate in our church or what's authentic to ourselves. Like, if you're up on stage and your worship team is just doing these things because they're on stage, but if they didn't lead on Sunday they wouldn't do it, then they probably shouldn't be doing it on stage either, because we want to be authentic. So back to my point though, we want to watch others so we get an idea of some of the things that we can do on stage, and that'll give your team some ideas. Like, okay, this bass player did this, and I'm a bass player, so like I can't raise my hands while I'm playing bass, but they look into it, they're singing along, stuff like that. It'll give your team ideas of how they can improve their stage presence and modeling worship for your church. Step number 3 is to communicate, to actually talk about it and have conversations with your team and say, okay, this is what I see, or this is what we see. That question that I shared with you at the beginning about what would people assume about worship if they just saw your worship team leading, that's a great place to start with communication, but you've actually got to talk about it and make a plan to improve it. We're going to get to that in just a minute, but talk to your team. If they aren't pointing the things out that you're seeing, point those things out. Chances are they are going to point those things out because they'll recognize their own awkwardness, but just talk to them about it and say, hey, you know, like what I see is a bunch of musicians on a stage staring at our music stands. You could say that. I think that's objective truth. People can look at the video and be like, yeah, you know what? I stared at my music stand the whole time. And then you can lead people past that and be like, okay, well, maybe instead of having our eyes closed the whole time, we want to have them open and we want to engage and connect with the people that we're leading. Maybe when we aren't playing our instrument, we raise our hands. Maybe we clap at fast parts of the song, or whatever it is. Communicate with your team. And now that you've evaluated, you've watched others lead worship, now actually lead them in, okay, here are some things that we can try. The 4th thing you can do is to memorize your music. Encourage your team to memorize their music. That's right, I said it. I believe that worship teams should have their music memorized, because one of the benefits is that it helps you model worship easier. You aren't tied with your eyes directed down to your music stand, looking at it for the entire service and never looking away from it and not really engaged in the song because you're just leading or you're just playing the notes that you need to play, like that. So whenever you memorize your music, it frees you up to just worship for you personally, because you aren't worried about what's going on the piece of paper, but you actually know the song and the song is inside of you and you can just play it and it just comes out of you, and that allows you to focus on these other things that you need to focus on whenever you're leading worship, one of those things being modeling worship for your church. So I'm just telling you, memorize your music. If your team is struggling with stage presence, that's going to help so much. And finally, number 5, putting what you learned into practice and actually practice stage presence. Not just on Sunday morning, but at your rehearsal. Remind people, like, this is a rehearsal, but it's not just the musical side of things. Yes, that's a key part of it. Like, we're here to learn the music so that we can lead worship on Sunday, but we're also rehearsing to lead worship. So one of those things that we can practice is not just music, not just speaking transitions, but we can actually practice modeling worship and having stage presence for our church. And there's nobody in the room, and we can just try some things. And maybe it feels awkward the first time you do it, but the more you do it in private, the more comfortable you'll be when you do it in public. So encourage your team to try singing along to the songs. Maybe it's hard for them to sing and play at the same time, but the more they do it in practice or rehearsal, the more comfortable they'll get with it. And maybe they can actually do it on a Sunday morning then, or encourage them to raise their hands or to clap. Like, we want to build these disciplines in private so that when we lead publicly, they just are natural to us. So encourage your worship team to practice stage presence, practice modeling worship for your church. This video was ultimately about leading your worship team, and I think one of the best ways to lead your worship team is to actually sit down with them and talk. Like, we aren't just leading them musically, but we want to lead them spiritually. And one of the ways that you can do that is through devotions. And so I have a free devotion that I want to give you that you can lead your worship team in. It's got a little bit of teaching at the beginning and then some questions at the end that your worship team can have conversations around. And it's going to lead them in this understanding that they aren't just there on a Sunday morning to just play music. No, we are leaders. We are all worship leaders, and we have a high responsibility because of that. And one of those responsibilities is modeling worship for our church. So if you want access to that free devotion, just click the link in the description below and lead your team in it and start this conversation with them. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Spencer Cormany from leadingworshipwell.com. Until I see you in the next one, keep leading worship well.